note in this part of the reading, which I have highlighted, should be able to see on your screen. So it reads like this: critical theories attempt to fulfill potentially two desiderata at the same time. So the first one, they want to maintain the normativity of philosophical conceptions such as truth and justice or justice, while at the same time they want to examine the context in which they have developed and may best be promoted practically, right? So normativity we have already discussed, right? But then I think you can well imagine with the kind with with the rich knowledge that all of you, I'm sure, have about the major philosophical developments, right? In the tradition of philosophy. Uh, so the understanding that most of the philosophical pursuits or philosophical dialogues or philosophical reflections, as you read them, right, as an as, as one of the most obvious examples, probably if you read something like um, uh, something by Plato, for example, right? It's a far-fetched reference, but still uh, something that most of you must have come across. You might notice over there that uh, at places the reflections of the um, you know uh, of the philosophers or the reflections in the book, they tend to be universal. So that seems to be the most uh, cherished goal of the philosophical thought, is to universalize the concept, right? Which of course has its own value, right? But then that universality comes at the cost of contextualization. So you have to drop the context in order to universalize a context, right? In order to universalize a concept, right? But critical theory is doing this apparently, unconventional task of bridging the philosophical concepts and their normativity with their immediate context, right? So they want to examine the concepts like truth and justice in practice with reference to the context in which they are taking place or emerging, right? So that becomes a little challenging work because that requires two different methodologies, right? uh, if not if not the application of methodologies, then at least understanding of those methodologies is required. Okay. uh, so the, so for example, the a philosophical concept usually develops through logic, right? And that is what one needs to be aware of in order to understand how the concepts are developing. On the other hand, um, to understand a context of a philosophical concept, you need to be aware of uh, uh, different methods which have been employed by, say, a certain sociologist to describe a context, or by a particular political scientist, right, to describe a context, right? So only if you are aware of those methods, then you can understand what context is being developed or what context uh, is out there to the operationalization of justice in a given society, or to the operationalization of democracy in in society. So, for example, if you want to explore the question of democracy with reference to Pakistan, you need to be aware of the uh, context, right, to the development of the concept of democracy with reference to Pakistan. And when you do that, you cannot just count on pre-given notion of what constitutes the context. Rather, you need to be to get the disciplinary awareness of how this context is working, right? And that disciplinary awareness will come from the pre-published research, right, on the context which is available to democracy in Pakistan. I mean, this is a little far-fetched example because as we know that Frankfurt School is not really about, South Asia, or, it has its own context which we need to keep in mind, right? Um, okay, so the writer of this piece says that I argue that the first generation theorists avoided the relativism of sociologies of knowledge such as Mannheim's, only to fall into a practical skepticism about the feasibility of agents acting upon such norms in current context, right? So initially in the first generation, there emerged a challenge where uh, because the writers in the Frankfurt School thought and the thinkers in that, they were ignoring a sociological relativism which was being promoted by writers like Mannheim's. The consequence of that avoidance of relativism of sociology of knowledge was that immediately, not immediately, but soon, the Frankfurt School started realizing the limitations of their methods, because they started developing doubts about the practicality of those factors which they were arguing could contribute to the establishment of cherished norms like truth and justice, right? So for example, they started observing that kind of broader context which they were trying to promote in order to understand the working of say freedom in German culture, right, in German society, the kind of free floating context that they were trying to build their concepts on, those free floating contexts were not working. But they realized this deficiency only at a later stage, when they started understanding that even the context, right, even the context that they are so much promoting and which they favor so much for a philosophical inquiry, even those contexts are relative, right? So critical theories had already done a done substantial work to understand that the concepts like truth or justice or freedom or democracy or equality, they need to be studied with the understanding of the context. Only then we can treat these concepts as normative concepts, as producing real change in the society, right? So that was done at the first generation level. But then these writers also started realizing that even if they had become aware of the uh, the contextual understanding of the normative concepts, yet the critical theories were not working productively enough for them, because even if they had come to understand the uh, relevance of the normative concepts, sorry, not relevance, but relativity of normative concepts like truth or justice, even if they had realized that these concepts are relative and they were relative to the context, yet they still needed to go one step further, which was to understand that even the contexts are relative, right? So given the context through which they are looking at these concepts, given that context, the meaning will continue to change, right? Therefore, they will have to relativize the context as well and look at these concepts and enhance their understanding of the practicality of these concepts and concepts with reference to the changing context, right? So freedom in Germany, freedom as a concept in German context would have different debate compared to freedom in the United States, right? So 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 they have to be aware of those contexts, right? So relativizing the context too, right? And I'm sure you immediately realize that how slippery this exercise of critical theory immediately becomes, right? So our, I mean, just to quote an example, so our practice of, for example, using uh, uh, a certain uh, uh, literary theory, say developed by any follower of Althusser, right? Using that theory in order to study the the institutional apparatuses in Pakistani context, right? This will just be a ridiculous exercise, right? If we look at this exercise from Frankfurt School perspective, right? Because the institutional apparatuses, if there are any, the institutional apparatuses of oppression, if there are any in Pakistan, they need to be viewed from, the context which emerges from, you know, uh, from Pakistan, right? Uh, I mean, this is tricky, right? I'm not giving any solution right now, but I'm just referring to an example, right? How if we treat both the concepts and the context, both of them as relative, then we are on, slippery slope, and we have to be very, you know alert in what we are doing with our analysis of any normative concept with reference to its constantly um, changing context. So so Habermas, of course, is one major, philosophical voice, along with the, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer in the modern German thought. So Habermas, where is it? Conception of the cooperation between philosophy and the social sciences and rational reconstruction of practical knowledge allows him to articulate a normative conception of real democracy more fully, and to develop a social scientifically informed conception of democracy that is an alternative to current liberal practices, right? Now this is where I said that in the previous passage that we discussed, uh, uh, I said that we will address this real democracy at a later stage. So now is that time. So the real democracy, right? So Habermas was proposing a kind of real democracy, right? So democracy, of course, is not a new concept, right? So Habermas, writing somewhere in 1970s and 80s, uh, you know, um, giving this concept of real democracy, to which Frankfurt School also, um, agrees, and they're, kind of they seem to be on the same page with Habermas. So what is in this concept of real democracy, right? So this kind of new real democracy is a kind of democracy which, number one, has to be a normative concept, right? So it should bring the change on the ground, right? So for example, if we're talking about empowerment of common man through democracy, then that empowerment should be visible on the ground. So that is something which is obvious. But uh, something which is controversial, in not controversial, but which kind of contends with the existing understanding of democracy in Habermas' thought, is his proposal that the new democracy that he is proposing, or the real democracy that he is proposing, it should be social scientifically informed concept rather than a liberal concept, right? So in the liberal practices, there is uh, a tendency to uh, you know uh, uh, treat democracy or any other concept like democracy as uh, ideology, as an ideology, as an ideological truth. Therefore, or thereby, the challenge to, every challenge to the democratic concept as it comes from certain power centers, every challenge to that concept of ideological concept of democracy is considered to be a kind of heresy, right? It is considered to be an act of an act of rebellion, uh, because then in that case, a concept like democracy, it becomes a tool for uh, liberal politicians, right? Or the politicians who present themselves as protectors of liberalism across the world, right? And they will be too hasty in order to bring penalty to those pockets of dissidents, right, who might not agree with the given definitions and forms of democracy. So though Habermas is proposing an alternative to that concept of democracy, which is based upon liberal practices or liberal practices of the West. And in opposition to that, he is proposing social scientifically informed conception of democracy. So what will happen in that case? In the case of social scientific informed democracy, democracy will continue to remain a concept which every moment of its own life is being constantly investigated through an interdisciplinary approach for its ability to produce human happiness. So it should be social scientifically informed and on constant grounds, right? So, which means the application of critical theory, right, on the concept of democracy as constant guarantor of human happiness and an order in a society and all those benefits that we claim of, right? So if democracy does not continue to remain a normative concept or does not produce its required results, the claim over here is that we are ready to give it up and replace it with another concept of governance, right? And of course, this is a painful thought for liberal politicians because I shouldn't say maybe liberal politicians, I should say liberal thinkers. For liberal thinkers, because liberal thinkers would take certain concepts for granted at the level of an ideology, right? And they will foreclose certain questions, right? For example, in okay, no, let me not quote that example, but I hope you get the point. So we continue here. So this project, right, the project of critical theory, shifts the goal of critical social inquiry from human emancipation as such to the primary concerns with democratic institutions as the location for the realization of ideals of freedom and equality, right? So human emancipation, the phrase as it goes, it itself is a liberal tool. This phrase, this concept becomes liberal tool because it cannot be vetted against. The concept of human emancipation is too broad and too vague to be vetted against any social scientifically informed criteria, right? Therefore, the social critical theory replaces that with the concept of democratic institutions, democracy and democratic institution. So the beauty of democracy is that it is considered to be operating through institutions, and institutions are run by policies, by people, by certain laws, by certain acts, right, which can be subjected to analysis, right? So human emancipation has that tendency of once again idealizing human independence into into an ideology, right? However, the concept of democracy as it works through democratic institutions is very difficult to be treated as ideology. Rather, it has to be constantly accountable to a social inquiry and a social, critical practice. So the human freedom and equality and justice and all those, uh, normative concepts, we, from critical theoretical perspective, we consider those concepts to be operating on the basis of democracy through democratic institutions. And that is why, and that is how we, through critical theory, make an analysis of these concepts possible. So we can use, for example, social psychology, or we can use, any kind of sociological research in order to measure, right, the outcomes of certain institutions as the components of democracy, right? And we can measure their outcomes, and then we can reflect on the possibility of sticking to those institutions or modifying them or disintegrating them and introducing new ones. So the limits on any such realization may prove to be not merely ideological. Critical theory is also interested in those social facts and circumstances that constrains the realization of the ideal democracy and force us to reconsider its normative content, right? So critical theory has that inbuilt tool, right, to identify where any of these concepts is falling into an ideological form, right? And as soon as it happens, critical theory has that potential to undo that concept from inside, right, and replace it with another concept. While such an account of the relation between facts and norms answers the sociological skepticism of Weber and others about the future of democracy, it may be based on overly limited account of social facts, right? So of course we are constantly in that struggle where we have, um, I mean, even if there is apparently a plethora of social facts out there, but when we talk about social facts for the sake of analysis, there are always limitations, right? Because it's it's very difficult to refine facts out of lot many um, opinions that will surround us, and lot many agenda driven researches which always surround us, especially when we deliberately give up the concept of disciplinary constraint, right? So one of the limitations that we often impose on our own research projects when we undertake them is that we clearly state that this kind of inquiry is going to be, say, a literary analysis, a textual analysis, or whatever nature of that analysis is, and our primary text is going to be this particular text. It could be a literary text, or it could be an institutional form, right? For example, the education system in Pakistan, right, that can be treated as a text which would be informed by multiplicity of the texts in the form of the educational policies and the constitution, or the legislation and all of them, and we can read them and analyze them and then come up with with certain uh, suggestions or analysis or ramifications, so on and so forth. But we take this disciplinary uh, the restriction as kind of by default position. Now, critical theory is pushing against that, of that tendency of imposing a priori, a kind of by default uh, disciplinary imposition on our critical inquiry. It is asking us to stay open and first identify the problem and then adapt our methodology according to that, right? So I'm not saying that we are or you are going to necessarily uh, do that kind of research project, right? But we are interested in learning how Frankfurt School has actually operationalized that, right? And I think the understanding of this canon and then its ramifications, which come later on in the form of some of the critical theories, just the understanding of that and reading of the some of the works that they have produced itself, I think is a productive exercise, right? And then we can take that to other enterprises, other courses that you are taking, or maybe if you want to go for uh, you know uh, post masters, post and field studies, you can take this